Hello, everyone, and welcome to Making Remote Work. Today, I have the honor of welcoming Liam Martin, who's the co-founder of Time Doctor and the co-organizer of Running Remote, and an avid practitioner of everything remote. Liam, welcome to Making Remote Work.
Thanks for having me.
Can you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about of what you do and maybe a bit about the conference that you're running?
Sure. Liam Martin, human being on planet Earth. More specifically, I am currently located in Canada. I'm at my bug out location since the virus started. So I've been here for about 3.5 months, which has been an interesting kind of exercise in humanity, I guess you could call it. Been working remotely for about 15 years. Ended up starting a business out of grad school, which was focused on online tutoring. Ended up selling that business. Then the problem that I had inside of that business was adequately measuring how long a tutor worked with a student remotely. And that's what brought about Time Doctor, which is a time tracking tool specifically for remote workers to be able to measure how long they're working and figuring out what they're doing, and works really well if you have an agency or something like that to be able to bill out clients specifically. And then a few years ago, we ended up also opening up Running Remote, which came out of my also frustration of not seeing enough information about not necessarily how to hire a virtual assistant or how to be a digital nomad, but how do you go from 100 remote employees to 500 or 500 to 5,000? The logistics of building and scaling a remote team. So we ended up starting that about 3 years ago. The last two were in Bali, which was very beautiful. And then the last one was supposed to be in Austin, which unfortunately got canceled due to everything in events getting canceled. And we are now running virtual events as well until the pandemic is over.
Wonderful. Why are you such a remote work enthusiast? What got you into remote work? You didn't start working remotely, right?
Yeah, well, kind of. So just short version, remote work offers you the amount of freedom that literally no other type of way of working offers you. We're in definitely a state of flux right now where remote work is proliferating across the world at a rate that I just never would have even perceived of until the pandemic. And the reality is I am able to work from my home. I'm able to work from a co-working space. I travel about 6 months out of the year, so I can work from various locations around the world. And so can everyone else that works inside of our company. So to me, it just boils down to freedom, being able to do that thing. It empowers you to live a life that very few people thought was humanly possible even 20 years ago. So that's kind of the short version. The longer version is the reality of remote work actually is very, and we're only discovering this now, which is something I'd love to be able to get into in this podcast. The economic advantages of working remotely are unprecedented. It is the single best way to be able to improve the net profits of your business, because you're in essence getting rid of the biggest cost, which is the office. Outside of staff, your office costs are your next biggest line item on a P&L. So by deleting those and recognizing that you're actually going to become more efficient, not less efficient due to that process, complete game changer. And it's interesting now because we're seeing Fortune 500 large enterprise live in front of our eyes recognize that at a breakneck speed, which is also very exciting.
Are you a proposer of all remote, or are you more a proposer of hybrid? Because I've heard there are like Gitlab, they would say all remote. Most of the companies that I've spoken with, especially those transitioning right now, they're thinking of a hybrid.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the points that you have to take into consideration is someone like Dimitri, as an example, from Gitlab. They're remote first. They've always been remote. So when you start remote, it's very easy to remain remote and not go hybrid. Someone like Wade from Zapier he actually has been suggesting that he go to an office. So they started remote and they're thinking, well, maybe we need an office for some of these types of jobs inside of the business. We at Time Doctor, we ended up hitting our heads against the wall constantly on how to build a remote sales team. We lost millions of dollars trying to build a remote sales team. We finally cracked it, but it required a lot of trial and error to be able to get there. So I think that hybrid is a really good stepping stone for on-premise companies. So, if you're an on-premise company right now, I'm hearing a lot of people saying, well, we're going to make our support team remote, or we're going to make our marketing team remote. I think it's an inevitability that they will go from hybrid to full remote. Just from a dollars and cents perspective, because there'll be two forces that I think will occur. Number one, the employer will recognize how much money they're saving. And then on the other side, the employee will get frustrated with, well, why does support get to be remote and I have to go into the office? Why don't I try going remote for a month? And inevitably, you'll have to let that person do that. They'll produce a really good work for that employer. And then the employer will say, well, my hands are tied. We got to go full remote. So I think I think they're actually lying to themselves, to be completely honest with you, in terms of that hybrid model. I think it's just an in-between step because they're scared.
Okay. And the reason why I'm asking is one of the issues that I keep encountering when I talk to companies about remote, especially the hybrid ones, is they have political issues, right? Those that are in the office, they have a FaceTime with their managers, with the leaders. They can immediately bounce ideas, and they can talk about work at lunch, right? Outside of the meetings, outside of the video calls. This happened even before COVID. But when some of the people work remote and they are not part of those conversations that happen in the office, and right, this will take place as well, right? We are moving back into hybrid status. They don't have access to those discussions, and maybe decisions have been taken. And even if they were part of the project, they were not part of the decision, and they just hear, or sometimes there's even lack of communication and they don't even know what has happened. They just don't hear anything. For me, I think that's one of the key items that maybe will decide, are we all in the office or are we all remote? That's hard to deal with if you are an outsider. Yep. You really stay as an outsider if you work remote like that.
Joel Gascoigne and Amir from Doist both talk about this. They call it founder islands. And Amir, as an example, he lives in Barcelona and he has about 4 or 5 of his employees that live in Barcelona as well, but they are not allowed to go into the same co-working space as him. So specifically, he's building barriers for access. So what ends up happening is, and Joel talked about this as well, he moved to Boulder, Colorado. Joel's the CEO of Buffer. And then people were coming to Boulder to be able to work with him, people that worked at Buffer. And he recognized that he needed to stop that from happening, because then they would get preferred access. So there's like tier 1 and tier 2 remote workers. The way that we solve it at Time Doctor is, let's say that we were going to do a meeting and we were all in the same 4 or 5 of us was in the same physical room, but the meetings with 8 people and 8 people or 4 people are completely remote. We will all meet on separate Zoom deployments. So we'll all have our laptops open and we'll all communicate directly. I'm also, just for anyone that's building a remote team, as a founder or an executive, you need to be really mindful of being resistant towards decision-making for people that are face-to-face. And it also creates an environment in which the documentation that occurs in remote teams is beautiful, because everything needs to be commuted digitally. But then when you're face-to-face with someone, you just don't document those types of things. And if you look at Gitlab, they're a fantastic model of this, because everything that they do is completely open. Even for running remote, they ended up sponsoring running remote, and all of the email exchanges that we had are published on their open database. So anyone, you can just type in running remote GitLab and you can see all of the email exchanges that we have inside of the organization or inside of their organization. that type of openness is really the direction that you probably would ideally like to go in terms of making remote work very well. I understand the reality that when you look at companies like Gitlab, they are not going to be corporate America. That's just not going to be the reality of what's going to happen. It's going to be a different interpretation, but hopefully they can take a component of that and even just understand that there's a particular guidepost that you need to deploy, which is make sure that face-to-face people, you want to be biased towards their decision making, and you want to be more aggressive on agreeing with people that are remote to be able to offset those two situations.
How do you feel, by the way, about the handbook, the Gitlab handbook? Are you able to have something similar in Time Doctor?
We do.
Okay.
Yeah, we have one that's internal, so we don't share it with everybody. I really love that the guys from Gitlab have published that, and it is something that I promote every single time I'm doing a talk about process documentation, because they give you the framework right then and there. And Dimitri, who's the CTO and co-founder of Gitlab, encourages people to steal it. Just fork your own, repo, and you have all your processes and you can edit for your own purposes. I think it's about.gitlab.com/handbook. Mm-hmm. I think that's the right URL. And it's that's another big part of remote teams that a lot of people don't really want to talk about, which is the boring part. I call it almost kind of like the doing your taxes or accounting of building a remote team. Is all of your processes need to be digitized, and they need to be documented, digitized, and put on a system that anyone can gain access to. So inside of our company, as an example, when we onboard someone as a new worker, there's about a week of just documentation that they have to get through, and they're quizzed at the end for all of that documentation, because it's so important for them to be able to navigate that environment effectively. Because when someone is in Hong Kong, as an example, and I'm in New York, that's a 12-hour difference. That person must be able to figure out answers to their own questions without my management.
Definitely. That's why I asked, because I think moving companies that are just now moving and they have never been habituated to documenting things, they will have a terrible hard time. And without transparency, I think remote is very hard. How do you see remote? Where would it fail? Where do you see the points, the breaking points?
To your previous point with regards to documentation, show me a company that's 500 people and has no documentation, and I'll show you a liar. It's one of those things that if you're 5 to 10 people right now and you think, oh, documentation is one of those things that I need to do in the future, you're absolutely wrong. You need to document everything right now. The more you document, the more successful you will be. And I know it doesn't feel like that, but it is absolutely true. We have a full-time process documentation person, full-time salary. Their job is just to be able to create processes and keep all of our processes up to date inside of our organization. We've made that level of commitment for 100 people inside of the company to be able to deploy on that. So to the failure point, I mean, process documentation is probably top 2. The other one is communication. So how do you communicate effectively inside of remote teams? Remote teams are much slower on collaboration than in-person teams. It's absolutely that's one of those things that until we build tools that are better suited towards that type of collaboration, we're never going to overcome that problem. And on our side, we realize that communication is one of those things that we've always had such a massive challenge with. And the playbook really hasn't been built yet as to whether or not you should be doing video calls, as an example, or should you be doing audio, or should you be doing synchronous versus asynchronous? Should you be doing emails? I have a hierarchy of communication, which is in-person beats video, video beats audio, audio beats instant messaging, and instant messaging beats email. As you move up the chain, you become more synchronous. As you move down the chain, you become more asynchronous. And I've always been of the philosophy that we should be moving as much as synchronous as humanly possible. However, someone like Amir, as an example from Doist, completely disagrees. He thinks that the more asynchronous that you can get, the better, because it allows you to have clear right. So you have very clear focused time, which is an interesting. It's interesting to see where the founders' mindsets are. So Amir and Dimitri and Seb are all developers, right? Someone like we were having a debate between Amir from Doist and the guys from Help Scout. So Help Scout believes that we should be synchronous. We had this debate, but Help Scout is coming more from a marketing and sales perspective. So the playbook really hasn't been built yet. Like, we don't know what's the right mix. And to be completely honest with you, I think it entirely applies to your job type. Developers need blocks of time to be left alone and not bothered. Someone like me, who's more on the marketing side, I really am excited by communication and collaboration. It's one of the core components of who I am as a person, and that helps me work more efficiently. So I'd love to be able to provide like an answer, but that's actually the reason why we built a conference like Running Remote, was to specifically hammer down what's the right mix? How should it work? What's the playbook? No one's figured it out yet.
And then you will see I already recorded a podcast with Professor Roderick Swab, but he talks about all of this in the context of customer negotiation and negotiation of any sort. And then he gives a bit more clarity. But what you're telling me is really important, because we are building a list right now with the rest of researchers and academia that basically made this podcast, right? To understand what are the next areas of research that practitioners are looking into, somewhere where they don't have answers. And where they're coming from. All of the remote work research has been done previous to COVID-19. Now everyone is forced to move, and they're facing different challenges, right? For a researcher to get up to speed, they need to understand the questions, they need to understand the problems, and then they can design the research and give solutions and answers to those issues. So it's really interesting, because I had the impression that everyone was trying to go towards asynchronous. From all of my discussions with Gitlab, with Mark Frein from Lambda School, former Envision, I somehow got the feeling that asynchronous was, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you're putting yourself inside of a gilded cage, right? So this is one of those things that I think remote work is so much bigger than what we've currently conceptualized it of. And I think, and I love the GitLab people. No offense whatsoever to what they're doing. I think they're absolutely monumental in terms of leadership at this point, in understanding where we are and how we can help other companies. However, if you take the GitLab model and you apply it to Deloitte, you're probably going to blow up in your face, right? It's a different type of organization, different type of structure. Just to be able to say that there's a one size fits all is unfortunately not the case. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the disadvantage of academia is it moves very, very slowly. So the research should already be done now, because we're going through a shift in labor that I would argue has not been experienced since the Industrial Revolution. By our numbers, we estimate about 60% of the US workforce was working remotely in April. And before that, in 2008, it was 4%. Full-time remote. So a complete shift in understanding how remote work is happening. And we've always been based in a tech startup mindset for remote work. And I think we need to really put a lot of energy into understanding how corporate works remotely, because I think it's a different animal.
Oh,
and
definitely.
I might get a little bit of hate on that one, but because I think the remote work right now has had almost a lovingly so fundamentalist perspective with regards to there is a very specific way to do remote work, and that is the only way that you can do remote work. and a very passionate group of people. But and there's a friend of mine that I've been chatting with from Profitwell, Patrick Campbell, and he had seen on his data analysis that remote first tech startups grow slower than on-premise tech startups. And he was just showing the data because he had the data set available to him. And he got such a massive amount of hate for that statement or for that finding, but it's just data, right? So we should really just be moving in the direction of the data and understanding where it is. And the other thing that I think is important to take into consideration is remote work will not necessarily be a utopian future. We thought about computers being the way that we would only work 1 hour a day and everyone would be super happy, and we'd have manna growing off the trees without any problem whatsoever. And the reality is that's not what happened. There were positive things that happened with the age of computing and internet access, and there are a lot of negative things that happened. And I think exactly the same thing is going to happen with remote work. And to look at it pragmatically is probably the best way to do it, and not necessarily discount other opinions that don't feed into that singular narrative.
Oh, for sure. We have to take all the data. I think this is what researchers are missing right now, and they miss and they're building right now, not that they're missing and not doing anything, but they're building right now relationships with companies, right? So they can understand what's happening, collect the data, and then use some research method to understand what's happening. And there is a difference between a PwC and a Deloitte, who maybe has access to their customers and can get some data from there and run some really quick research, versus an academic research where you have to form the groups, have peers who review your paper and then publish it and all of that, which can take a year and a half, 2 years.
Well, and there's also a selector bias, I think, inside of that entire environment, like you had mentioned with regards to asynchronous communication. When you're thinking to yourself, well, who are the remote companies? And you think GitLab, InVision,
Twitter right now, Facebook.
Right. So these are all tech companies.
Yeah.
And they come from a development background, as opposed to, let's talk to 3M. Sasha Connor, who's a fantastic remote work consultant. She was the first employee to go remote at Clorox, which is a company that sells bleach. And how does a company like Clorox go remote? Well, it's a very, very different process from the way that that Twitter or GitLab goes remote. So
definitely,
it's good to get an understanding of all of those different companies.
For sure. I was the first one working remote for a French company, and they've never heard of it. And they pretty much said, no, you can't do it. We love you, but you can't do it. And in the end, they accepted. But as an employee in a company where you're the only one doing it, you have to make all the effort. There will be no effort from the company.
Right.
You raise your hand, you're asking for it, you are doing what needs to be done so you can be present. You travel or whatever, but you have to make it work. So that's an interesting take. How do you think we want to continue working remotely in the future, or do you think this is just hype? We're going to move there 10, 15 years, and then we will realize that, hey, innovation works better when we are face-to-face. Collaboration works better, even communication, because we've had this issue of communicating forever and ever. Do you think this is just 10, 15, 20 years and then going back?
Okay, yeah. So I think I'm going to make some bets here. I'll bet you $1 that within 10 years, people will be asking to go back inside of the office. So there will be employees that say, I don't want to work remotely. I want to work inside of an office, because it will shift so much to the other side. However, I think right now, remote work is an employee perk. And I think within the next 5 to 10 years, remote work will be an employer perk, meaning the employer will say, we cannot operate our business model without it being remote. Because when everyone else, so I'll give you an example, small example of what we do. We're able to acquire talent we're able to acquire really top tier talent for a much more cost effective price. So we don't, just in the news recently, Facebook had stated that they are going to lower your salary if you leave San Francisco and you work remotely. And that's another interesting debate to have for large corporate, right? The realities of those P&Ls and where they fit and how corporate America is going to adapt to remote work. But we don't do that. So we'll, as an example, say, well, we're hiring a new developer and we're going to pay that developer 60,000 US. Well, that means that somewhere like San Francisco or New York are completely out of the realm of possibility. But the Midwest or Eastern Europe or somewhere in Asia, those are all open. We ended up hiring a developer who ended up getting third place in the Facebook hackathon back in 2014, and he was from Bangladesh. He got a $600,000 offer from Facebook, but he ended up working for us for about a tenth of that because Facebook would not let him work remotely. And instead, he said, well, I want to stay with my family. And 60,000 in Bangladesh is like 600,000 in Palo Alto. So that was such a huge tactical advantage for us. And that situation is going to very quickly disappear, unfortunately, because the talent is just going to go everywhere. So I think also as well, when you see Twitter, Facebook, Shopify, I can't remember, there's a couple other big tech companies that have all gone remote. We're talking about, let's say, 100,000 remote workers or workers that all make more than 200,000 US per month. So we're talking about 0.1 percenters of the global population in terms of earning potential. They are all going to go, I think half of them will be remote and will probably be in places like Medellin, Ubud, Canggu, Chiang Mai within 2 years. And then there will be a very interesting counterpoint to that, which is they'll recognize that geography does not denote skill. And right now we've had that unconscious bias inside. Just because you're in San Francisco, you're automatically a better developer. Incorrect. There are developers in Kiev that are as good. There's our guy in Bangladesh who got third place in the Facebook hackathon. He's the absolute top tier developer on planet Earth. And that talent is going to be able to compete openly with everyone else that has now gone remote. And I actually think that this is quite possibly one of the biggest threats towards San Francisco being the core of the tech industry that they're not even recognizing, because they just opened up Pandora's box and have given tech startups permission to be able to hire talent remotely that's as good, but is a lot more cost effective. So that's a very interesting side issue that I think we're not even kind of recognizing at this point, where all of these people will leave. And I believe that their salaries will probably be very significantly cut in the next few years.
How do you deal with, because this was one of the issues that Facebook faced right now when they moved everyone remotely. There was a lot of backlash from the employees that they're going to cut their salaries because they're moving somewhere else. How do you deal with this at Time Doctor? How do you set the bandwidth of salaries? Yeah.
So we don't have salary bands based off geography. We simply just hire people based off of where they're located. So we have people that are paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year because that was what we had to pay to be able to get that type of person. And then we have people that are paid tens of thousands of dollars per year because that's what we could hire for that position. It's just market rates. And for us, we look at it in that context. So if you're a support rep, as an example, and let's say that there's a support rep competition between someone from Toronto and someone from Cebu in the Philippines, they should have the same salary, and we should just all compete and figure out where the best talent ends up. And if that's the person in Cebu, congratulations, you're now making way more money than anyone inside of Manila, inside of the Philippines. So like that's a very easy calculation for us, but we may have to change that philosophy pretty soon, because I actually think this opportunity that we've had the last few years maybe has 12 to 18 months left before that opportunity will cease to exist, because the talent, Envision is doing this perfectly. So they're buying talent from Toronto, Atlanta, the Midwest. They're hiring a lot of really good talent, particularly from North America, but they're not hiring talent from New York, San Francisco, Boston, these cities that have historically been the hubs for tech, because they're recognizing that they can hire someone for 70,000 and their value is as much as the $160,000 person in San Francisco, which is why they're growing so quickly. If you look at the way that their org chart works, like there's 1,000 people at Envision. They're not hiring those people they're getting those people for 50 cents on the dollar. And the people that are working in the Midwest are very happy to get those jobs at 50 cents on the dollar, because in comparison to their local geography, they're one of the top tier employees in that area in terms of earning potential. So I think it's a win-win. It's interesting to see where the debate is going to end up, because it will probably get to a point in which you're not just competing with people in the Midwest, you're competing with Mumbai, with Kiev, with all of these cities that are pumping out really good talent that is very cost effective. I think their salaries will go up. And then I think these major cities that have really been based, the reason why San Francisco has become so big is because of venture capital. It'll still always be a place to be able to raise money for venture capital, but you might just have the executive team in San Francisco and everyone else is distributed remotely.
Yeah, for sure. I think maybe it will last more than 12 months, to maybe a few years, because companies which are really big, they are moving slowly on this. They have certain salary brackets. They are based on country, jobs. It's very hard to change this politics. And I'm working with some of the big names as well in recruitment, and they have not changed yet. They are still afraid to do it. They're still discussing this. They see the potential, but it takes a longer time to implement for sure. So the smaller companies, I think they still have a chance right now. But it's for a recruiter, this is the dream. It's less biased, it's more diverse. You can look for talent everywhere, and you can really support companies in getting the best out there in the market, because you can search everywhere, right? You're not limited to a location where maybe the headquarters is, or maybe a vice president of sales decided to set up a camp, right? So it's kind of interesting.
We've had some interesting debates about that, because whenever we set what I would almost define as like an unlimited salary cap, so we don't care how much the salary is, we end up mostly actually hiring talent outside of or within North America, which is interesting. And that may also be our own personal bias connected to, because we're North American, but it's when we readjust that salary cap, even let's say we bring it down like 10%. So instead of paying $200,000 for an absolute top tier person, we might set our salary cap to 150. Wow, things change almost instantaneously. And there's such when you're not looking for the 1%er, but you're looking for like the 2 or 3%er of talent, the competition in comparison to when I compare like San Francisco, New York, Boston to Eastern Europe, as an example, there's no competition. I think that we're probably going to see a huge transfer of wealth from primarily the United States to people that have PhDs in computer science, as an example, and are living in Kiev and are very happy to make 100,000 US per year versus 200,000 US per year. And it's going to be such a game changer. And you're going to see this not just happen. This is not just going to be 1 or 2 developers. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people that are going to be moving. And then that creates a whole bunch of other implications, like how do you pay those people? legally? What are the legal implications of doing all of these types of things? Because we've just started to see countries crack down on that problem, which is remote workers and where are you located and how do you operate. I think that's going to get 10 times worse. I don't know if you've been following the news with regards to remote.com. GitLab people have basically built a payroll system for the planet and for remote workers. These types of technologies and companies are going to be absolutely critical for the proliferation of remote work, because in a lot of these countries, we're not hiring them legally. And legally is actually even an operative word, because no one really knows how to hire them.
Yeah, definitely. And then even if they have a company and if they only have one person paying them, one other entity paying them, that's still considered in most of the parts illegal, right? And then usually governments come back and chase you to employ them. By the way, this is one of the things that I wanted to discuss with you, because even if it's 10, 15, 20 years, and then we maybe move to hybrid again or whatever, we change our minds, there's still enough time to have a different view on jobs, how the job of the future would look like, how the career of the future would look like if we are moving remote. What are your thoughts on that?
How a remote job will look
would our careers change because of this shift to remote work?
Boy, that's another debate as well. I mean, there was a vision of the future even a few years ago inside of remote work, which was the gig economy, right? The Upwork, the freelancers, the Fiverr.com. And I respect those companies, but I don't think that that's the future of work for me. I think that longer term engagements are really where you end up having a mission, you have a direction, you have a feeling of what you're going to do with your career and your career path. I just don't think you're going to see it on these gig websites. I think they'll probably have a place. We still use those types of platforms if we need a very small job done. So as an example, let's say if I need to install a tracking pixel inside of a website, it's much more easier for me to be able to pay $5 to our guy on Fiverr to just install it than to spend the $40 of labor internally to be able to do it, because they know all of our processes. But I don't think it's going to change all that much, to be completely honest with you. It's going to be, I think it's going to be pretty much the same, because I think if you're a developer, as an example, we don't hire developers for, a month. We hire developers for years, because you just logistically need to actually have so much background knowledge in our code base, as an example, to even do meaningful work. So I don't think that will fundamentally change. I don't know what your perspective is on that, but it's an interesting one. It may change, but to me, I was thinking pretty much remain the same.
Maybe because companies tend to move quicker than governments, and right now, legislating the how a freelancer works or how a company works and the benefits that you get as a freelancer or as part of a small company that you maybe started are way less than if you work for a company, for an employer, right? And if you are employed. So if the governments, that's my feeling, if the governments don't move fast enough, so as freelancers you can have a pension and unemployment and all of that, I see no reason why people would not get employed, right? And I think it might even hurt the gig economy if I'm allowed to work from home, from anywhere, on my own schedule, asynchronous, as part of a company, to have meaning and to be part of something bigger, right? And not do accounting on my own, which is terrible. I might give it another thought. Because you still have the same kind of freedom and you still work with colleagues, right? And it's perfectly the same, and you can manage your own time. If they make you go into an office, then that's different, right? That's not a perk anymore. But I think gig workers might lose some or might see it different if companies start implementing this. And I was thinking that maybe if you work from home at some point, and if you stay a gig worker or work on projects, maybe you can have 2 or 3 careers at the same time, work on different stuff that interests you, and maybe take 3 hours of a day to work for Time Doctor, and then I can work 2 hours of a day to run the podcast, and so on, right? And then I can have multiple options at some point in my life, maybe.
Yeah, I think that also connects to personality types as well.
True.
So I know for me, I have a major problem with focus. One of the reasons why we built Time Doctor as well is it's a productivity tool to be able to keep people focused. And it's because I'm not very good at it. So for me to commit, one of the things that we did when we started the company is me and my co-founder, Rob, we had inside of our initial agreement a minimum amount of hours that we both had to work on Time Doctor per week, or our shares would get damaged from our vesting period, because I had such a problem about focusing on one singular thing. And now I don't do any consulting whatsoever with regards to remote work, even though I'd love to, and I get offers all the time to be able to do it. It's because it's an issue of focus for me. I would be so in the weeds. I'm so passionate about this subject that I would get distracted and I wouldn't be able to focus on what I need to do. So I think for some people, they could probably divide their time equally. For me, it's a lot more difficult to be able to do that.
Yeah, I'm sure it will depend, but I think at least it will give you the opportunity to do something different. Maybe it's sure. A thought. I'm curious how this will change. As well. Liam, I know I promised you I could speak with you like 4, 5, 6 more hours.
Right.
And I had a lot of fun listening to your podcast as well, to your recordings on remote work. And if anyone wants to view them, they can go on YouTube, Running Remote, right? That's
youtube.com/running remote. And also
there's a
all
wealth
of
of information there
too.
Yeah. Which I really love, and I had a lot of fun going through it. Any last thoughts on remote that you would like to share with everyone?
I think we're at the tipping point with regards to remote work. Actually, I think we were at the tipping point around March, and we're currently June 2nd. So interesting time that we're in. I think for anyone that is interested in getting into remote work, now is absolutely the time to do it. And I think every day that you don't do it, the opportunity is starting to slip away from you. And I also think from a business perspective, I know there's a lot of academics that probably check out this podcast as well, but from an entrepreneurial perspective, there's going to be such a massive infrastructure of tools that need to be built and companies that will need to be built in order to service the 4 to 60% that I talked about before with regards to remote work. And now is the time to be able to start those types of businesses, because there will be multiple billion-dollar companies that come out of this situation. And if you are sleeping on this, you will miss out on an opportunity of a lifetime.
I agree. Liam, thank you so much for your time today, and I hope we can do this in the future as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me.